Welcome classic rock fans to one of my discussion videos, and the topic today is Rush. Were they better in the 70s or the 1980s? I personally find Rush one of those bands to be so musically diverse and thematically rich that you find with every listen of their albums it reveals new and intriguing nuances. In fact, if you go back to the video I did, Rush Worst to Best, even that ranking would be very different, even in the span of time of a year since I filmed it. However, I must confess that I do listen to Rush fairly often, and I've come to the rather disturbing conclusion, I have to say, that 1980s Rush, for me, is better than the stuff they did in the 1970s. I don't know if that's sacrilegious to say that, but maybe you can change my mind on this. This band have gone through many transformations since the 1970s, from sporting Village People-esque facial hair from those interesting intergalactic progressive forays that some critics have dismissed as a little bit nerdy, not to mention that infamous kimono photograph. Then of course we get the 1980s with much shorter, concise numbers, highly polished numbers, heavy on the synth, and mullets, of course, let's not forget the mullets, and Alex Lifeson's glorious Flock of Seagulls Barnet. But the 1970s Rush is for me very much defined by those very interesting, sprawling forays, inspired no doubt by Neil Peart's interest in science fiction and dystopian fiction as well. And let's not forget, of course, this Rush is heavily guitar infused, and we get Geddy Lee's glass worrying vocals. Of course, by 1980, everything seems a lot slicker, with the emphasis on new technological gadgetry. And some have complained that Lifeson's guitar is too subdued, too subterranean, way too low in the mix for their taste. Nevertheless, both incarnations are musically complex and intriguing. There are those who understandably prefer the pre-Tom Sawyer era, but I myself have really begun to appreciate and enjoy the beauty, the profundity and the balance of their 80s material. Although I have to say both periods of Rush are at their very best when they tackle quite profound philosophical polemics. Rush's first album is a powerful opening statement. It certainly lacks the profundity and conceptual brilliance that Neil Peart would bring to the table, certainly from the second album onwards. You could say the band were kind of still finding their way. It has a very Led Zeppelin-y quality, but it's very Lichtenstein pop art sleeve, which is somewhat arresting. But I think it's fair to say it lacks the rhythmic and conceptual journeying that we would get with the albums that follow it. In terms of their 70s period, I have to say that I think that Hemispheres and Farewell to Kings are far superior albums to 2112. My God, I can anticipate all the bile and hatred spewing forth in the comments below. And that's of course before we get to this masterpiece. In fact, one critic has said, if I may refer to my notes, which is a bit of a catchphrase for me now, Permanent Waves was their goodbye to the uber-progressive sidelong epics and paved the way for the more keyboard-laden 1980s. Yes, I totally agree. But there's no doubt that this new streamlined material owes a huge debt to the groundwork that this band did in the 1970s. Ultimate Classic Rock has said that 70s Rush were analogous to the band's adolescence, and the 80s were their young adulthood. Both were great eras in their own right, but I think the 70s period of Rush is perhaps more important in terms of the development of their musical identity. By the time we get to Rush's synth period, and Rush had already been exploring certain interesting textures and sounds with keyboards before we get to an album like Signals. Certainly on the Signals album, they become intrinsic to this band's sound, but the difference, of course, with the earlier Rush albums is these keyboards, this new technology becomes a foundational compositional tool rather than just an ornamental one. Some critics have argued that the shift to Permanent Ways helped this band to stay relevant. Not that Rush were ever that interested in that, or chasing musical trends. I think they were far more interested in their own musical evolution. Certainly marks a move away from what Rolling Stone rather disparagingly refers to as the metal anachronism of those 70s albums. And we see on a lot of their later albums there was a return to a more guitar-laden sound. But it's a guitar-laden sound with a difference, one that's been influenced or evolved from the platform that was that synth period. Anyway, let's talk about Grace Under Pressure. If you're interested in a full-length review of this album, you can find one on my Patreon. Do consider becoming a member. Anyway, this album sees the recruitment of a new producer, Peter Henderson, and the band continue their experimentation with different sounds. But what's fascinating about this record is what is achieved. It has an iciness and a clarity to it. However, many Rush fans found themselves increasingly alienated by this new artistic vision of the band. Although one of the casualties of this album, I think, is Alex Lifeson's guitar is very low in the mix. I think even Lifeson has commented on that. The songwriting, the lyrics are excellent. We expect nothing better from the brilliant set as Neil Peart. We get wonderful, wonderful songs like Distant Early Warning, which is certainly a standout number on here. Kid Gloves, Between the Wheels, and the rather disturbing Red Sector A. What's fascinating about this album is the way it sounds. It has a brittle, icy quality. Some critics have dismissed it as nihilistic. But even Lifeson's guitar, which punctuates this album rather than dominates it, has an icy tinge to it. We get these wonderful atmospheric stabs here and there. It's certainly a frosty offering, and it helps evoke a sense of unease and dread. Rolling Stone, of course, dismissed this album as one that lacks melody. Permanent Waves is an album that is remarkably good and often dominates the very top of any Rush ranking videos. It's an album where the band embraced more modern textures, there's no doubt about that. There was a move away from those more fantastical elements of sort of Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres. But they kept their hard rock credentials, if you like, intact. Just some of the themes, I think, were more realistic and more grounded. And on this one we get those two wonderful anthemic numbers, Spirit of the Radio and Free Will. But it's not without its epic numbers, of course. We get Jacob's Ladder is on this one, and not to mention Natural Science. But overall, there's a shift away from this conceptual grandeur that we got with Hemispheres. But what is also fascinating about this album is Geddy Lee starts to sing in a slightly lower register, something he probably was quite grateful for in some of their later tours, no doubt. But we still get some wonderful musical virtuosity and complexity, some torturous tempo changes, crippling riffs. It's like Yes on steroids. And Lifeson's guitar on this album has a tonal quality which is broad and cinematic. We talk about the Signals album, and this album features very high on my list, almost I think now I'd probably rank it just below Moving Pictures, which is my favourite album. You get all those banks of synths and digital wizardry. One critic has rather disparagingly referred to as the oral equivalent of dry ice. But it's done absolutely brilliantly, I think. I mean, a lot of bands that started to invest in all this technology in the 80s, even some of the progressive bands, we ended up with this technological sludge. We certainly don't get that here. The keyboard sounds on this are not forced or intrusive in any way. It's to my mind, it's a very progressive sounding record. And we get some of their greatest tracks as well. We get Subdivision's New World Man. And Neil's lyrics were still centred on subjects that deal with the challenges faced in youth, as well as the juxtaposition between tradition and modernity. The sound here was very fresh and very modern, very stark even, as Rush take us into a completely different hemisphere, perhaps. With Moving Pictures, they achieve a wonderful balance and sense of musical husbandry on this album. They achieve the perfect midpoint here between a past that resembles a hazy Roger Dean cloud map and the present plucked from a Tron cityscape. I love the glittering harmonics that very much define Lifeson's guitar parts on this album. Tom Sawyer kicks things off, and we get the wonderful number on here that explores Neil Peart's troubled relationship with fame and celebrity in the guise of limelight, as well as looking at the problematic relationship bands often have with the music industry. One critic has said of the song Limelight and the camera eye are striking anecdotes of these conflicted feelings which channel the horrific images of stripped identity and the crushing weight of the music business machine. Welcome to the machine. Anyway, so there we have it. At the risk of being pilloried, which is no doubt to come, I'm going to suggest that 80s Rush is better than 1970s Rush. And I'd love to hear what you think about this. Please leave some comments below and take the time to click like, subscribe and check that bell to get notified of any future uploads. Become a Patreon. Of course, there's a wonderful body of work on my Patreon now. Other than that, just leaves me to say I hope you're all staying well, staying safe, but more importantly that you keep listening.